morning. It is really great to see all of you here for week 4 of this series. And what we've been doing through this series is reading through Hebrews 11 and kind of highlighting some of these various individuals that we find here in this picture Bible back here. And but also, in addition to that, what we've also been doing is hearing about kind of from our own local heroes, like our own family of faith. Our own faithful family that's kind of right around us. And so we've had somebody kind of each week share so far. And so far, we've had 4 weeks, and now we'll have 4 people share. Once we get to 5, there's a maybe, and 6, there's a maybe, and then we'll see. So if you're kind of sitting out there going like, well, they don't need me to volunteer to tell my story, we probably do. Not just because I need to fill space, because I got enough, right? Not just to fill space, but we all benefit from when you tell your story. We all benefit when you tell us what a lived out faith looks like. We all benefit when you say, hey, here's what was going on in my life. Here was the darkness. Here was the despair. Here was the misery. Here was the difficulty. And then here's what my God did in the midst of it. Like, we all benefit from those stories because we all struggle today in the here and now. And we need people who will say, you can do this. This is possible. You serve a God who says, hold on. And we can get through this. And so today, Jason is going to share. Not Jason Group, Jason Pellicati. Do you want to come up here or down there? Okay.
Hi, Jason. All right, let's see here. All right, so talking about faith, many of you haven't seen me too much I'd say the most over the past, 4 years. Mostly coming to church. Wow, there is light, bright light. So, but I actually grew up here as a kid, coming here as a kid, and I always thought of church. I always thought of my grandmom because she was always the one that stressed it. So thank you for that. Brought me closer to God throughout the years. So I don't know if many of you know I've been working in a prison for 24 years now. So talking about sin, darkness, that's all I grew up with was darkness. It was the majority of my life was working in a jail, dealing with people, different tragedies, and some of the things that I have seen people should not see and that I've had to deal with. So throughout the years, it's been a little rough. I always knew Jesus. I knew who he was. Should I have been more faithful? Yes. Was I? No. But I always knew who he was. Talked about Jesus, about church, about faith throughout the years with a few people from work. I still keep in contact with a lot of them. Fast forward to COVID. A lot of people had tragedies, just sicknesses and loss. I was an anti-vaxxer. I was like, I'll be fine. August 21, I contracted COVID. I got COVID pneumonia. I ended up going to the hospital. And it was quite a battle, my struggle for breathing. I got a little bit better. As my mom can attest, there was a time where they thought I was getting better, and I completely took a reversal, collapsed in the room. I just couldn't breathe. It felt like somebody put a plastic bag over my face. There was no way I could get any oxygen. At that point, I actually wanted to die. It was just the scariest moment. So I laid there. As the doctors rush in, the nurses rush in, I actually prayed to God, just take me. Take this pain away from me. And he didn't. And the struggles continued. I ended up getting transferred down to Philly, waited there over the course of 3 months, ended up having a lung transplant. The battle just continues. There was times I didn't think I was going to make it. My pulmonologist says, you wouldn't have made the new year. I would not have seen 22. And there's Plenty of times I sit here and I think, of course, when it comes to transplants, somebody's going to lose their life. Somebody has to sacrifice their life, no matter what it's through, for another person to continue living. And I think about my donor. I don't know my donor. I think about him all the time, him or her, whoever it is. And I ask God, why am I still here? I could have been the one that lost my life, and my donor could have been living. Nobody knows. It doesn't matter. I had some of the best doctors. They can only do so much. So with that, we all get faith to continue on, because without God, we're not going to have any hope to continue forward. So each day, although it's a struggle, no matter what our testimonies, we don't know why we go through it, but we have to have faith that God's going to bring us through it and continue on. So here we are. Thank you for listening. Thank you for letting me share.
Well, the good thing is when you're up here, they're a pretty captive audience. They don't argue and fuss and fight back a whole lot. But we are grateful. So I'm just going to tell a little bit about the story, but so his name came around for us to pray for a long time before we got to this point. And there were many prayer groups and just individuals and leadership that kind of prayed for you. And what I think is just remarkable is to see, and I don't see the full circle, right? Because I wasn't here, I wasn't here with you when we were both kids or whatever else. But to see you back and in leadership and involved and serving on the church board because you recognize what God did in your life. And we're grateful for the role that you continue to play here and the example that you set for all of us with regards to faith and what it looks like lived out. So thank you. Thank you. And also the occasional object lesson, right? Remember when I pulled on his arm and then I was afraid I was going to hurt him when I pulled on his arm? I'm going to put this in there so we can one day lose it. So, all right. So again, I am glad that you're here. What we're trying to do through this series. Oh, you don't want it in there? Okay. All right. So what we are doing through this series is kind of just highlighting or looking at this Hebrews chapter 11, right? Sometimes referred to as the Hall of Faith or the Hall of Heroes. And in Hebrews chapter 11, what the writer gives is this really brief statement. And that's really what we're getting here. When the individuals talk and when we share what's going on, we're getting this really brief statement. It's usually a little briefer in Hebrews. It's 30 or so words, right? But we're getting this brief statement. We're getting this little snapshot into someone's life and seeing how they lived. And what the writer of Hebrews is trying to convey is the same thing we're trying to convey here. It's the same thing us as believers recognize is that where we are right now isn't the end-all be-all. This isn't the ultimate destination. Having whatever you think you need on this planet, on this plane right here is not the most important thing. There is another land, there is another place later on that's destined for us. And the writer in Hebrews says this. He says, all of these people died in faith, which is really a disheartening way to start a passage. All of those people died, but it was in faith, without having received the things that they were promised. However, they saw them and welcomed them from afar. They acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. They were longing for a better country. They were longing for a heavenly one. And so each one of these individuals that we read about in Hebrews that we're listing from here, they wholeheartedly believe that they're citizens of a different place. They're citizens of another country. They belong here as citizens, but also there's the other place that's more important. And that vision that's given to each and every one of us should impact the way that we live. We should look forward to heaven, right? I look forward to that. I can't wait for that day. But that day should also inspire us to live Christ-like, to live as if his kingdom is coming in the day and age that we live in, the stuff that we do day in and day out. And so the example from them, the example from those within our own body is that it is possible to live a life of faith in our world today. It is possible to live, not it is impossible to live. Like, that's the other thing that we think. It's impossible to live a life of faith in the world today. There's so much against us. There's so much that says you cannot or should not do this. But what we see over and over again in the lives of the saints, both here and now, is that it is possible to live a life of faith in our world today. It is easier, I think, when we see the example set before us, which is why we have these testimonies, which is why we have Hebrews chapter 11. And so far, this is where we've been in Hebrews chapter 11. We've talked about Abel, who offered God a better sacrifice. If you remember, it was the best and the first than Cain did, who eventually brought the leftovers. We talked about Enoch, who walked with God and was commended as one who pleased God. We talked about Abraham last week, who by faith obeyed, and when he was tested, he reasoned that God could. Remember, he worked it out and said, I believe that God can do this thing. I believe that God could do this. And so today we're going to continue on in Hebrews 11. We're actually going to go back. If I remember last week I told you Abraham is actually talked about twice. And then right in the middle, there's this little segment about Sarah. And so we're going to go back and talk about Sarah, who is Abraham's better half, right? That's his spouse. And before I get into Sarah's story, some of you may know it, some of you may not. I want to just let you know, I want to just kind of warn you, I just want to kind of mention that her issue is a barren womb. Right? And there's no way we can tell her story without thinking about that's what's going on in her life. But what I want you to see is that her infirmity, her frailty, is exactly where God wanted her to demonstrate the greatest level of faith. Like, he came to her in that thing and said, hey, here's where I need you to have the greatest level of faith. And so we can't talk about her story without recognizing that infertility is a part of it, and that could hit very close to home for some of you. For some of us, we all may know people who struggle in this area. You may be someone who struggles in this area. But I also want you to know that that what's going on in her life isn't just infertility. That is not just what her story is about. Her story is also about discouragement and disappointment. And I think that's something we can all kind of see in our own lives. We can all recognize there's parts of our own lives where we're discouraged and disappointed, whether it be in our careers or our marriages or just life in general, right? We can be discouraged and disappointed. If you're never discouraged and disappointed, then you know what? I give you permission to leave now. But my guess is we all are, so we'll all hang out for just a minute. And so discouragement and disappointment are also the experiences of Sarah. And she is a woman who eventually comes to realize, kind of what Jason has said, that her only hope of seeing the promise fulfilled is by living a life of dependence upon God. The only hope of anything else is living a life of dependence on God. It is just as true today, clearly, as it was then for her. And so Hebrews chapter 11, verse 11, it's one verse, it is two parts. The first tells us what happened, and the second part tells us kind of how it happened. It says this: by faith Sarah, even though she was barren and beyond the proper age, was enabled to conceive a child, because she considered him faithful who had promised. And again, it's a short verse. Right, and her backstory begins in Genesis chapter 11. That's where we kind of go back to get the whole rest of the story. And it's a good part of Genesis, so we're not going to go back and read all of it. We'll drop in a couple places here. But in Genesis chapter 11, she's introduced, first of all, as Abraham's wife, which means she is the mother of Isaac, the same one that we talked about last week. And so we know, based upon what we read last week, we know based upon what we read in this verse, is that she eventually has a child, right? But that is the end of the story. It's clear here that at some point she was unable to have a child. And the issue sometimes with text when we read a Bible passage is that it's kind of cold. It's kind of callous. We miss what's going on behind it. And so when we read verse 11, by faith Sarah, even though she was barren beyond the proper age, wasn't able to conceive a child. Right? When we read through that, those few words, we kind of think it was a very quick product. That it was a simple process. That she just kind of was barren and then she wasn't. I can't have kids. Oh, now I can. Like it was that quickly was the way that we read this. But when you read her story, it is a lot more complicated. It is a lot messier than just, I wasn't and now I can. And so the thing that I think we have to remember about Hebrews 11 is that it's just this little snippets, right? It's this highlight. It's really what we see sometimes in social media. Like if you look at your friends on social media and they post, hey, they're in the most exotic places, the most amazing things are happening in their lives. But what we don't see is the hours and hours and hours and hours that they had to work to get there. What we don't see is the wrong turns and the detours and the frustrations and the disappointment that happened to get to that point. We only see the bright, smiling, happy picture. We don't see all the misery that led up to that. And that's what Hebrews 11 gives us. It gives us the bright, shining picture. We don't see all of everything that it kind of took to get to that point. And so we're going to kind of unpack a little bit how we get to the point where we get to chapter 11 of Hebrews. By faith, Sarah, even though she was barren beyond the proper age, was able to conceive a child because she considered him faithful who had promised. It's a simple verse, but there's a lot that goes on. And so Genesis 11, she's introduced. And then in chapter 12 of Genesis, Abraham gets the call to go. And what God says, he says, you will be a great nation. The earth will be blessed through you, and that this promise that I'm giving you will extend to your child that they don't have. Will extend to your child that they don't have. Abraham is, just case in point, keep this number in your head, Abraham is 75 at this point. 75 at this point, right? And he says, here's the promise that's going to happen. If you write it down, whatever you want to do, here's the promise, right? Great nation, all the blessed families that are through you, and the promise is going to go to you through your child that you don't have yet at 75 years old. And then over the next couple of chapters, as we get into 13, 14, 15, and so on, God reminds Abraham of the promise. He kind of renews his covenant with him. He keeps reminding him of it all along the ways. And Sarah plays a really major role in 12, 13, 14, 15, up until you get to 16, where we'll get to in a minute. She plays a really, really important role. And what I would encourage you to do is maybe at sometime this week, not right now, but maybe sometime this week, go read Genesis chapters 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, right? And then when you read them, then call me or text me with the questions that you will inevitably have, because you're going to read it and go, wait, what? How does she make it at the end if this doesn't make any sense, right? But it's all part of the story. It's all part of getting to where she is, where she's by faith, Sarah. And so all of these things are going on, and it isn't until chapter 16 that her story begins to take center stage with regards to the promise that Abraham is going to have this child. Through him, all the nations will be blessed, and the offspring, so on and so forth, right? And it's not until chapter 16 that she takes center stage in this. And by now, it has been 11 years. Promise given at 75, and it's 11 years later, about 11 years later when this part happens. God gave the promise 11 years later, and you have to imagine, if God has ever told you that something's going to happen in your life, at what point did you grow impatient? Right. She's more patient than I am. Be like, God, you promised this, but when? How long am I going to have to wait? Can you imagine how long waiting for 11 years is? Some of you may. You may have an idea of what waiting 11 years is like. And so that's what from promise to today, 11 years. And so they're bewildered. They're beside themselves. This should not take this long. And they're so kind of bewildered at this that Abraham has already tried to take matters into his own hands. He said, look, I have this heir in my house. He's one of my servants. He's going to be the heir of everything because I don't have any children. Why don't you just let the promise go through him? It's a good idea. He says to God, hey, I don't have one. It's been a while. Why don't we just let the promise go through him? And then God says, nope. It is going to be someone from your own body. That's what he says. Great kid, sure. Nothing wrong with him, maybe, whatever. But the heir, the promise, the offspring is going to be from someone through your own body. And that seems to alleviate kind of Abraham's concerns for a while. He kind of stops and he kind of says, okay. But it does not alleviate Sarah's concern about the promise. And in her mind, 11 years is far too long. Far too long for God to do something. And so she decides to intervene. And I have to believe she thinks she's intervening on God's behalf. And so this is what she does, Genesis chapter 16, verses 1 and 2. I'm going to read it to you, and then I'm going to give you dialogue. So when I read it to you, don't go, all right. I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to give you the dialogue. So hold on, right? So this is what she says, Genesis chapter 16, verses 1 and 2. Now Abraham's wife Sarah, it says Abram's wife Sarai, but that's a whole other thing, just name change as they fulfill the promise, comes later on. But anyway, so don't get hung up on that. Now Abram's wife Sarai had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, look now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Please go to my maidservant. Perhaps I can build a family by her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. Now, let me state the obvious here. This is the part I don't want you to get yourself. Let me state the obvious part right here. When we read things like this, when we're reading through the Bible and we come across passages like this, we should not take these as endorsements. This is not a command from God saying, here's best case scenario to get out of this. This is not God telling us what we should do. This is not telling us how we should behave, right? Can we get there? This is simply God saying, this is simply the Word of God saying, this is what happened, right? You've heard me say before, this is descriptive, not prescriptive. This is just what they were doing. This is not what God said, here's what I want to happen, right? We're clear there, right? Do not walk out of here. I don't want marriage counseling this week because you misinterpreted this passage. You've heard me, all right? But then the question we have to kind of go is like, well, why? Why would she say this? Why is this the solution to the problem? And for starters, I think it's very clear that they're both still learning what it looks like to follow after God. I think that's what's part of what's going on in their life. They're still figuring it out, and they're still getting it wrong a lot. Go read 12, 13, 14, 15 to get to this point, and even after this point. They're still getting it wrong a lot. It's not really all that different from maybe you as a new believer today, or as a new believer whenever you were a new believer. Think about when you first believed. How much did you get wrong then versus what you know today when it comes to following after God? You probably learned some things. My guess is there were some behaviors in your life, there are some activities, there are some actions, there are some thoughts and whatever else that took some time to get rooted out of your life. And you probably did some things early on as a believer that you now know were not God honoring, right? I know I did. I can give you a list, but I'm not going to, right? But that's kind of what's going on. And so in many ways, I think that's what's going on. So Abraham and Sarah are not all that different from you and I. They're in this, we might try and put them on this pedestal in Hebrews 11, but we really shouldn't. They're no different than what we live and experience day in and day out of our own lives. And so that may be a little bit what's going on, but I don't think it's the only thing that's going on. Because her suggestion is also kind of a customary activity, something they would do from her homeland. The idea was that a childless wife would provide her husband a servant girl who could do what she could not. And in those instances, the offspring of the union between the two would be considered the offspring of the wife. Right? And so this was common practice. I can't, so now you with her, and now that child is now kind of officially mine. Again, this is not an endorsement. This is not saying, here's what I want you to go do. I'm not even sure that this is addressing the topic of surrogacy, but what I want you to understand is where Sarah's coming from. Why is it that Sarah's taking these actions? Why is she doing what it is she's doing? She's doing this because she believes in the promise. That's what it comes back to. God has made this promise that you're going to have a child, and through you all these nations will be blessed. And she's going, well, I can't, so somehow we got to figure that out. And so she believes in the promise. And she wants to see it come to fruition through her husband, even if it doesn't include her. She wants to make sure God's will gets done. It sounds very well-intentioned, doesn't it? She may even frame it as, you know what, it is God's will that we do it this way. But well-intentions or not, it is terribly misguided. Because I know you caught the phrase because I underlined it, right? What's the phrase that I underlined? Perhaps I can build a family. What's the word there? Perhaps I can build a family is what she thinks she can do. Perhaps I can do this. What she didn't say was God can do this, even though it's been 11 years. What she didn't say was he can bring it about because he's the one that promised it to begin with. What she said was, I can do this. I can take control. I can make this happen. Because apparently God seems to be having some problems bringing children into the world. There are some things he can do, but this is apparently not one of them. And so what she decides to do is to take matters into her own hands. And let me tell you, she is not alone in this, is she? We're guilty of the exact same thing, aren't we? When life doesn't go like we think it should, we take matters into our own hands. We decide, okay, God, this is taking way too long. It was a simple thing you told me you were going to do. It shouldn't take a week. I cannot continue to wait any longer. All of my friends are, everyone else is, whatever it is. and we go, I'm going to do this myself. Right? You've been there. Yes. This happens all the time. We know we're supposed to wait. We know God is saying, just wait, and I'm going to do it. Here's what I'm going to do, and I want you to just wait. But we don't. What we do instead of just waiting is we go do something. We kind of just go and do anything. We do whatever. We can reason out in our little heads, like, here's the best thing to do. Here's the way to bring that around. When all God says was just, hey, I'm going to do it. And that was it. Sometimes I should keep my mouth shut. Go ahead, is that what you said? So Melanie will tell me to do something. I'm like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. I just didn't give her a time frame, right? That's what's going on. Amen. Thank you, right? I'm going to do it. I just didn't give her a time frame. That's kind of what this is, right? No, not like that. Stick to your notes, right? Okay. I know better. But here's what's going on. God just says, I'm going to do it, but he doesn't tell her when, doesn't tell them how, anything like that. And so they can't wait. And so they have to do it on their own. And then here's the thing that we've talked about numerous times. I've mentioned it before, that God is rarely ever early. Rarely in any situation do we look at life and go, God, I think you showed up earlier than you needed to here. We go, God, you cut that one really close, didn't you? But the thing is, regardless of what we think one way or another, his timing is perfect. Right? He comes into it when it really needs to happen, not when we wanted it to happen. I think sometimes if we knew how it was going to happen, we'd never step into it, would we? If he said, hey, I'm going to do this, but it's going to take 30 years to work it out. We'd go, nah, that's all right. I'll do something else. Do you have anything that's like a week? I'll take like a week commitment. But that's not what he does. He rarely ever. But he's also never late. When he shows up is when he needs to show up, right? But us, we panic. When we look around and we think that nothing is happening, then we think that God forgot about us. We look around and see that nothing is happening and it's been a while, and then we think that if something's going to get done, then we're the ones that are going to have to go and do it. And there's the problem in each and every one of us. We think that we're supposed to do something, when the reality is, we think we can't wait because waiting isn't active enough, but waiting is probably the most active thing that we can ever possibly do. Waiting on God is intentional. If you're going to wait on God, you have to it takes incredible focus. How often do you wait somewhere? And then do you just kind of sit? No, you're playing the game at the restaurant, right? You're reading through the menu. You're scrolling through your social feeds. You've got your book on tape or your literal book or what. Like we don't wait well in general. We make ourselves busy doing something while we're waiting. You see, the problem is that the waiting is supposed to be the active thing, not the solving the problem. I love London's shirt. It says something to the effect of, have you prayed about it as much as you've thought about it? Right? And that's the problem with so much of our lives. It's clearly the issue that's going on in Sarah's life. We have to consciously think about waiting. We have to decide I am not going to take it into my own hands. I'm not going to do what I want to do in this situation. I'm going to just wait. We have to force ourselves to wait and listen for what God wants to do. All the while believing that what God said will come to pass. I wait, force myself to wait. What God said, he's going to work out. Otherwise, when we take matters into our own hands, it doesn't end well. It definitely doesn't end the way that God intended it to when we work it out on our own. And that's exactly what happens here. Sarah takes matters into her own hands, and she just makes a royal mess of things. I'm not going to get into the whole story. Again, Genesis 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. But the short of it is that things get pretty hostile between her and Hagar, as you can imagine. So much so that Abraham just kind of, at one point, he just kind of wipes his hands and says, hey, you do whatever you want to do. And he just kind of moves away from the whole situation. And the end result is that God chooses to bless the child of Abraham and Hagar, but he was never supposed to be the child of promise. This was not the way that it was supposed to happen. The promise that was given to Abraham was not supposed to come out this way. The plan all along included Sarah as the mother of, even though she has yet to be mentioned. The plan still included her all along. And this brings us to chapter 17. Now, do you remember what the first passage of time was? 11 years. So between then and now, it's another 13 years. Right? So do the math. 11 plus 13. 24. I wrote it down. That's why I got it so quick. I'm not that good at math. But 11 years is enough. Another 13 is unheard of. 24 years for a kid? What kid? God. But here's what happens in chapter 13. God reaffirms the promise to Abraham, the promise that he's given him numerous times, given it to him, reminded of him numerous times, but this time he specifically lists and includes Sarah in the promise. For whatever reason, Abram is not that difficult from all of us. Men, we can be a bit dense. And we couldn't read between the lines. And Abraham missed it somehow. And so he spells it out specifically for Sarah as well. And this is what he says, Genesis 17, verses 15. He says, "Then God said to Abraham, as for Sarah your wife, I will bless her and will surely give you a son by her." Finally, as for Sarah your wife, I will bless her and will surely give you a son by her. But still there's no timetable. There's not like, hey, here's how long it's going to be. There's still no timetable given at this point. It finally includes Sarah. She's mentioned by name here, but there's still no, hey, here's how long it's going to take. But did you catch what God said to Abraham about Sarah in this? Oh, I underlined it. Of course you caught it. I will bless her. Who's going to do it? I will. God says, I am going to do it. And so there's this battle for superiority in their lives. She says, I'm going to take care of this. And God says, no, you're not. I'm going to do this. And that's the same battle we still fight when we relinquish control to God or we keep it for ourselves. He says, I will bless her and will give you a son by her. He said that he would do it. It was never about Abraham. It was never about what Abraham and Sarah could work out on their own. They were the recipients of the promise, not the means by which the promise came to be. They're just supposed to receive it. Here, it's yours. They didn't have to work for it. It was just going to be given to them. See, I think that's another part that we miss as well. They felt, I got to have to work for this because God has not come through in the time that he seems reasonable. And it was never intended that they work for it or create it on their own. It was that God would bless them with it, is that he would give that to them. And so then he continues on in Genesis 17, he says this. He says, I will bless her. She will be the mother of nations. Kings of peoples will descend for her. And then verse 17, it says, Abraham fell face down. Now, he's done this once before in worship of God. He's fallen face down. But this is what it says. Abraham fell face down. Then he laughed and said to himself, just laughed and laughed and laughed, right? And I imagine it's the good laughter that you can't quit. You can't just kind of shut up, right? He laughed and laughed and laughed. And then he said to himself, because it doesn't even say he said this. He said this to himself. He's thinking this. Can't even get his words out. Like connect, I think, some of these things, right? But he says, can a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Can Sarah give birth at the age of 90? Thinking that to himself. But God replied, he's thought that. He's laughing, uproariously laughing, lying on the ground is what it sounds like. And he says, your wife Sarah will indeed bear you a son, and you are to name him Isaac. And that's kind of key as well. But Abraham is, to say the least, he is so unconvinced. He falls on his face in laughter. He finds this genuinely funny, that this is going to happen to them in their life now. That he and Sarah are going to have a son at 190 respectively. The whole thing is comical. And then what makes it even funnier, what it makes it even more outrageous, is God says, you're going to name the child Isaac, which means laughter. So the whole thing just has to sound unbelievable. Like, really? Is this where we are now? What this also means, though, is that God is going to do the miracle kind of the old-fashioned way. Some things he does remarkably, some things he does simply. But Sarah still doesn't know that she's included in this promise yet. This is still kind of talking to Abraham. Sarah still, she's been named, but she doesn't know she's a part of this promise, that she's an integral part of the promise. That doesn't happen until chapter 18, which is apparently just a short time later. It's not years and years and years. It's just a short time later. And here's what it says. Chapter 18, verse 9, and God asks, he says, where is your wife Sarah? He's asking Abraham, where is your wife Sarah? And then he says, there in the tent, he replied. This is where we pick it up in verse 10. Then the Lord said, I will surely return to you at this time next year, and your wife Sarah will have a son. So finally, we get the timeline. A year. I'm going to come back in a year, and by that time, you're going to have a son. So now we got the clock. It's finally kind of started, kind of ticking. We know when it's coming. Right? It's been 24 years. We knew nothing. But now he finally says, I'm going to come back in a year, and you're going to have a son. And then verse 10 continues. He says, now Sarah was behind him, listening at the entrance to the tent. And Abraham and Sarah were already old and well along in years, 190 from the past chapter, already old, well along in years. Sarah had passed the age of childbearing. It means she's not having kids anymore. That's not physically possible for her to do anymore. She's beyond that stage in life. And so she laughed at herself. Same thing Abraham did. She laughed at herself, saying, after I am worn out and my master is old, will I now have this pleasure? Verse 13, and the Lord asked Abraham, because he's talking to Abraham, Sarah's outside the tent. He says, the Lord asked Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, can I really bear a child when I am old? Talking to Abraham still. And this is what God says. He asked the question, why did Sarah say this? And then this is what he says. Is anything too difficult for the Lord? That's the question he asks. He's talking to Abraham, but Sarah clearly hears this because she's just outside the tent. Is anything too difficult for the Lord? And then he says it again. At the appointed time, I will return to you. In about a year, because for some reason he's got to spell it out to Abraham, right? So he says it again. At the appointed time, I will return to you in about a year, and Sarah will have a son. And so Sarah's response to hearing that the Lord has said, you're going to have a child, is to laugh. Now, she catches a lot of grief for laughing at God's promise to her, but she has the exact same response that Abraham does. It would seem that maybe hers is more of a scoff, right? That maybe she finds it impossible, while Abram just kind of found it funny. You could kind of read that in there. The text really doesn't give us any clarity in that. It's the same word, it's the same idea in both of them. It just tells us that they both laughed. But I think when you look at God's response to each of them, he kind of leans into that maybe there was a little bit of a difference in their laughter. When Abraham laughs, God tells him rather matter-of-factly, your wife Sarah will indeed bear you a son, and you're to name him Isaac. And then when Sarah laughs, it seems to be more from this disbelief, and that's not the normal and natural way that things happen. In fact, nothing's happening in here anymore. I am, and he is beyond the childbearing years. And she's probably laughing as well. It's like, we tried to make this work a couple of different ways, and God said, no, that's not right, we're not going to do it that way. And the reason that none of those things were it was because they came from the place of, I will do this. Not from the place of, he will do this. So God's not blessing those because he wasn't in them. That was not the intention. That's not the way it was supposed to do. And so I think when she laughs, God is challenging her disbelief. Again, he's speaking to Abraham, but she clearly hears this. Is anything too difficult for the Lord? Directed at Abraham, she hears it. Now, I can't prove this. We can ask her when we get to heaven. We can all go find Sarah and ask her. But I think this is the moment when it shifts for her. I think this is the moment where something happens and she begins to recognize and understand the promise a little bit differently. Because this is the moment where up until now she knew the promise and she's tried to figure it out, but in this moment it's spelled out differently. There's no room for assumptions, there's no room for guessing, there's no room for filling in or wondering. God spells it out differently. He's asking the question, is anything too difficult for the Lord? And so now the question has been posed and she can't ignore it. It's a question before she does anything else, she has to answer. Is anything too difficult for the Lord? Yes, I better take it into my own hands. Or is anything too difficult for the Lord? No, I better just actively wait. The answer she comes up to is is he the God in whom all things are possible? Or is he the God who is incapable of fulfilling the promises he's given? Is he a God who can do what he says he will do, or is he a God who cannot do what he says he will do? And again, that's where a lot of us are. We're discouraged in life. We're disappointed with how things are playing out. It's not the way that God said it would happen. It's not the way that we thought it would happen. He hasn't done what he said he would do. He hasn't come through like he said he was going to come through. And so we feel like I got to do something. I can't keep waiting on him. I have to do something. And this question hits us square in the face the same way. Is anything too difficult for the Lord? That's not just Abraham's question. That's not just Sarah's question. That's your question. And it's not just an introspective question to get you to take stock of your life. It's a question designed to help you determine who you believe God is. Do you or do you not believe that God could at any moment interrupt your life, your difficulties, your financial messes, your relationship struggles, whatever it is, with the fulfillment of what it is that he's promised you? Do you or do you not believe that? Do you or do you not believe that the Holy Spirit is just as capable today of moving in and through people? Do you or do you not believe that? Do you or do you not believe that God can do a miracle in your life? These are the questions we have to answer as well. We have to then figure them out. Some of it we answer by our actions. Some of it we answer by our inaction and our waiting. And this is not a question of how big your problem is. This is not even a question of how big your God is. This is a question of how big is your faith. That's what the question is. Your problem is what your problem is. God is who he is. The question is, how big is your faith? To what ends will your faith go? At what point do you say, I'll wait until now and then no more? Now I got to figure it out on my own. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Do you believe that his power can transcend your limitations? That is exactly the way it's always worked. He doesn't care as much as what we can do, but as much as we can't do, and say, that's fine, I will do the rest. When you lean into my power, when you lean into what I can do, that's the way that it's been designed to work. So she decides that she's going to trust him to do the impossible things. And that's exactly what he does. He does impossible things. Everything else was possible. They worked it out. I can name an heir to be the recipient. I can have a child and it's legally mine. But he does what was impossible, what could not be done. And then in less than a year, by the same time next year, has given birth to a son. Genesis 21:1 says this. It says, now the Lord attended to Sarah as he said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. It doesn't say Sarah did it. It says the Lord attended to Sarah as he said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he promised. He did what he said, he did what he promised. So do the math. 11, 13, 1, 25. Thank you. I wrote that one down too, but I was going to give you all a chance. 25 years after the original promise was given. 25 years after Sarah knew, hey, here's what's going to happen. How patient are you? There were numerous detours. Again, 16, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. Read those. There were numerous detours before we get to this, at this point where the child is born. But every single one of those detours were caused by Abraham and Sarah's impatience and their we know better than God attitude. Would it have happened faster? I don't know. You can ask God that later on if you're really interested. But I know it was messed up at so many different points because they thought, we have a better idea how to do this than God does. Clearly, he needs our help in doing this. So we're going to work it out on our own. So the important thing I think we have to catch is who did it. It wasn't Abraham with his chosen heir. It wasn't Sarah with her best laid plans. It was God and his infinite power and goodness that says this is how and when it's going to happen. Sarah always believed in the promise. I don't think there's a moment she didn't believe in the promise. What she struggled with was the how and the when was God was going to bring it to pass. And what she struggled with, what her doubts were in, was exactly where God met her. He said, I don't want you to figure that out on your own. You're not supposed to. That's not your lot in life. This is just something I'm just going to do for you. And that's why we can say of Sarah what Hebrews 11 says. By faith, Sarah, even though she was barren and beyond the proper age, was unable to conceive a child because she considered him faithful who had promised. First, I want you to catch, I didn't underline it because I wanted to bring it up. But it says because she considered, right? Didn't we just hear that? Right. Abraham did the same thing. Right? That's exactly what Abraham did. Sarah did it first. Because this is before when Abraham says it, right? And I think there's significance in that they do the same thing. Husbands and wives, never underestimate the influence you have on one another, good or bad. But I think the bigger picture, the bigger idea we're getting there is Sarah was not perfect. Here's what we have to understand about Sarah. She was not perfect. Are any of us? She was impatient. Are all of us? She took matters into her own hands. She got ahead of God and thus out of step with him. She trivialized. She chuckled at his promises. And she messed up time and time again. But in the end, when she was faced with this question of whether or not anything was too difficult for the Lord, she didn't just let that bypass and move out and go, I got to figure it out. She said, all right, let me deal with that. And the conclusion she came to was that this God who had made the promise to her husband and now to her, what she concluded was this God who had made a promise is faithful and trustworthy. He's going to do what he says he's going to do. Each and every time, good or bad, he's going to do what he says he's going to do. So here's where we are, and we'll close with this. Worship team, you can kind of come back up. We've all got stuff that's kind of going on in our lives. These great battles that we don't know how we're going to deal with, and these little everyday things that are just a nuisance and annoyances in our lives. But in so many situations, when we can have patience, when we can just wait on God so that he can bless something for later, we kind of just take it on our own and say, I'll just do this. It's not a big deal. It'll get me through. So much of our silly and sinful behavior is just this idea of, I'll just do this. It'll get me through. So much of our silly and sinful behavior is trying to shorten the length of time between what God wants us to have. Right? So I want us to see that. I want us to understand that. But I want you to come face to face with the question and answer it as well. Is anything too difficult for the Lord? What in your life? I'm really sorry I have to bring this up to you, right? But what in your life? You can't deny it anymore, but what in your life have you taken into your own hands and say, I'm going to work it out? And the question you should be answering is anything too difficult for my God? Because when you take it into your hands, what you're saying is this is too difficult for my God. And it will end in ruin, and it will end in greater misery than what you thought if you'd just waited. So find your way to an altar. It's a great place to just have a conversation with God. It's a great place to get out of your moment, to get out of your element. It's a great place to just say, I am going to surrender and move in a way that's awkward and weird, and someone's going to look at me funny. But you know what? I'm going to have this intimate and this unique encounter in this conversation with God. I cannot stress to you enough how important it is to not be comfortable in moments like this, but to go, God, displace me some. Help me to see it differently. Because the question, is anything too impossible for you? I have said yes so often in my life. And when you move to an altar, you're saying with your feet, you know what? No, Nothing is too impossible for him. And I'm going to believe he can do what he says he can do. So, Lord, we're grateful for your love, your grace, your mercy, this opportunity to come into your presence. Lord, we are forever and always grateful that we get to come here and we get to lift up your name. We get to worship you. We get to give you praise and adoration and recognition that you absolutely deserve. Lord, let it not just be words that we repeat, but let it be something that we deeply mean. Because, Lord, what it doesn't make you any bigger. It doesn't puff you up to any more than you already are. Lord, you are already all of that. But what it does is it helps us to see you differently. Because, God, when we recognize you as this tiny God, then we see limitations in you. But when we have spent time building you up and praising you and magnifying you in our lives, then all of a sudden we see you as greater than what's around us. And our faith in you is what builds. And God, we need the faith, because without faith it's impossible to please God. But more importantly, without faith, Lord, you'll never move in our lives. Without faith, we'll take it into our own hands. Without faith, we'll make the wrong decisions. Without faith, we'll cause harm and misery to ourselves and to others. Without faith, we'll miss out on the best things that you have for us. But with faith, Lord, you take in us what was once miserable and useless and broken, and you turn it into the most beautiful things. Lord, with faith, what we didn't understand, what we scoffed at, becomes the thing that we can't stop being overjoyed about. So, Lord, we all want that. We all want the fulfillment of the promise. But we live in the 25 years where we have to daily, where we have to every moment answer the question, is anything too difficult for my God? The answer to that in this moment determines the trajectory of our lives. Are we people of faith? And every now and then, it's not every now and then, it's all the time, these guys just hit it. And they sum up what it took me an hour to say. But in the big moments, and more importantly, in the small moments of your life, you're going to be faced with that question, is anything impossible for my God? And you're going to have a decision to make. In that moment, do I take matters into my own hands, and do I do it? Ultimately saying, I don't, God, think you can. Or do you go, God, I don't like the waiting. I don't like the way this has worked out. But I believe you can. And so what I'm going to actively do is not work it out, but I'm going to actively wait for you to give me the timetable. Is anything impossible for my God? I am going to tell you, I'm going to give you a little hint, a little help. No. Don't think otherwise. Struggle with it, deal with it, but come to the conclusion, nothing is impossible for my God. When you doubt, ask the people in your small group. When you doubt, go back to Hebrews 11. When you doubt, listen to the stories of your friends and loved ones who you rub shoulders with, because they are living proof that nothing is impossible for their God. So have a great week. We'll see you next Sunday on site, online, 10 a.m.